And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Philippians 1:9-10. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32.
This is Babbling On and Babble On, brought to you by Bible and a Bicycle on YouTube.
When we think about UFO sightings in America, the late 40s and 50s usually come to mind as the golden era. But honestly, some of the most interesting stuff happened in the 1960s. That's when we got the first big abduction claims from Betty and Barney Hill, Lonny Zamora's close encounter in New Hampshire, and the Kecksburg incident in Pennsylvania. But the most infamous case? That happened in March of 1966 in Michigan, where a bunch of people reported seeing strange lights in the sky. Since these sightings took place over swampland, the Air Force's Project Blue Book sent an investigator who suggested they were just seeing marsh gas. Basically, the same kind of thing behind will-o'-the-wisp and jack-o'-lantern folklore. Now, scientifically speaking, it was a reasonable explanation, but the public wasn't buying it. Swamp gas quickly became the go-to punchline among UFO enthusiasts as an example of the kind of ridiculous cover stories the government allegedly feeds people. Things got so heated that same year that the Air Force and Blue Book had to go on TV to do some damage control. But one guy who wasn't having it was a young congressman from Michigan, Gerald Ford. Yeah, the same Ford who later became president. He pushed for a congressional hearing, and in April 1966, the Committee on Armed Services held one, the first of its kind, where they reviewed Blue Book's work and interviewed key figures, including J. Allen Hynek. A scientific advisory board even chimed in, basically saying, Blue Book is well organized, but super underfunded. Following the hearing, the Air Force decided to shut down Blue Book and hand things over to a more academic research group, the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado. The ideal was to take a more scientific approach, but before long, people started accusing the committee of bias, claiming that they were just out to debunk UFOs. Now, to be fair, scientific studies often try to disprove things as a way of testing their validity. That's just how science works. But then a leaked memo came out, revealing that the committee members were reassuring university administrators that they would debunk UFO sightings. That little slip-up made UFO groups like NICAP lose faith in the whole operation. So, when the Condon Committee released its final report in 1969 stating that nothing in the 21 years of UFO study has added to scientific knowledge, many people dismissed it as just another government cover-up. That ideal only grew stronger over time, leading right up to today. And now, after 57 years, we've had another congressional hearing, this time with whistleblowers making some pretty wild claims about UFOs, or UAPs as they're now called, and government secrecy. Watching those recent hearings, I couldn't help but to think about all the others who have come forward over the years, claiming to expose the government's secrets about UFOs. And yet, somehow, it always seems to lead to the same conclusion. A whole lot of hype and not much else. As I watched this whole UAP drama unfold, I couldn't help but ask myself, is this the real deal, a hoax, or just more disinformation? Some of the recent hearings focused on those now famous UAP videos that went public back in 2017, showing strange objects caught on cockpit displays. But here's the thing. Skeptics like Mick West have offered some pretty compelling alternative explanations. He argues that what we're seeing could just be distant planes, birds, balloons, atmospheric effects, or even optical illusions. But then there's David Grush, the whistleblower who spoke to Congress this summer. He's not just saying he's seen unidentified objects, but he's claiming the U.S. government has actually recovered crashed non-human spacecraft and even non-human biologics. Yep, alien bodies. Oh, and he also alleges that people have lost their lives in the effort to cover it all up. Now, aside from the obvious reasons to be skeptical, it's worth pointing out that none of this is new. Since the 1950s, we've heard similar claims from plenty of other so-called whistleblowers. Looking back at those past testimonies, I think it's important to take a step back and ask, why should we treat Grush's story any differently? The first guy that comes to mind when thinking about Grush's predecessors is Donald Keyhoe. You could say he was the first to really push the ideal of a U.S. government cover-up when it comes to the UFOs. Like Grush, Keyhoe had a military background. He was a Marine, but he left active service after an injury in 1922. After that, he played a big role in organizing Charles Lindbergh's nationwide tour after his famous Atlantic crossing, even writing books about it, which kick-started his career as a writer. Keyhoe became a regular contributor to major magazines like Reader's Digest and the Saturday Evening Post. But his big break in the UFO world came in 1949. Around that time, thanks to Kenneth Arnold's famous UFO sighting, flying saucers were all the rage. True magazine asked Keyhoe to write about them, and he went all in, suggesting that the military and the Pentagon were hiding the truth about extraterrestrials. His article was a hit, leading to a book deal, and within a few years, he had cranked out The Flying Saucers Are Real, Flying Saucers from Outer Space, and The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Now, while he might sound more like a conspiracy author than a true whistleblower, the media often presented him as a credible military insider with connections in the Pentagon. Even the Air Force's own press secretary gave one of his books a positive blurb, which made him seem even more legit. He based a lot of his claims on official reports and interviews, so he didn't come off as just some random guy spouting wild theories. But here's the kicker. Before UFOs, Keyhoe was a sci-fi writer, publishing stories in Weird Tales. And as time went on, his UFO stories got weirder and weirder. To keep up the hype, he kept expanding the conspiracy, bringing in things like the Bermuda Triangle and even the debunked idea of a land bridge on the moon to suggest there were secret lunar bases involved. In the end, he was less of a military insider and more of an entertainer who knew how to keep an audience hooked. If you want a good example why Donald Keyhoe isn't exactly the most reliable source, just check out his 1958 interview with Mike Wallace.
Good evening. Tonight we go after a fantastic story.
It's here on YouTube if you're curious. And in that interview, Keyhoe boldly claims that the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, declared UFOs were real. Sounds dramatic, right? But in reality, all ATIC actually confirmed was that some of the sightings seemed to involve actual aircraft, not spacecraft, and that there simply wasn't enough data to determine what they were. Kehoe also claimed that ATIC had secretly concluded UFOs were interplanetary spaceships, but this seems to be a serious exaggeration of something Edward J. Ruppelt, the former head of Project Blue Book, mentioned in his book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Now, if there ever was a true UFO whistleblower, it might have been Ruppelt. Except his take on UFOs was pretty conservative. In fact, later on, he straight up called UFOs a space-age myth, and made it clear that he wasn't a fan of Kehoe, accusing him of sensationalizing the topic and twisting what military officials actually believed. That said, Ruppelt's book, probably written to bring some extra cash in after retirement, did include just enough intriguing details to excite UFO enthusiasts. He mentioned a supposed secret report that suggested UFOs were interplanetary. But here's the thing, there's no solid proof of this report ever existing. And if it did, reading closely, Ruppelt only implies that it reached such a conclusion, stating that General Vandenberg rejected it because he wouldn't buy interplanetary vehicles. He also notes that the report lacked proof. So it's far from the smoking gun Kehoe made it out to be. During the interview, Kehoe also references a 1952 intelligence analysis of UFO maneuvers as if it proves his point, but conveniently leaves out the Air Force's official stance, which Ruppelt himself reported. Quote, "The possibility of the existence of interplanetary craft has never been denied by the Air Force, but UFO reports offer absolutely no authentic evidence that such interplanetary spacecraft do exist." Unquote. This kind of selective storytelling was Kehoe's go-to move, taking things out of context or misrepresenting them to make his case sound stronger than it really was. To Mike Wallace's credit, he does push back on some of Kehoe's claims, catching him when he throws out some questionable, inconsistent statistics. But for the most part, a lot of what Kehoe says goes unchallenged. Pretty typical for an interview. After all, Wallace couldn't have been expecting to instantly fact-check every misleading claim Kehoe had lined up. But now, we can go back and take a closer look. For starters, Kehoe leans in on reports that have never actually been proven to exist. He also cites another report that specifically denied there was any evidence of UFOs, then immediately turns around and questions why the military would keep investigating if there was no evidence. And in almost the same breath, he argues that they must be hiding information about UFOs to avoid public hysteria. But let's think about that. If preventing panic was the goal, wouldn't disproving UFO claims also make sense, even if they had no real basis? Then, in a move that later conspiracy theorists would borrow, Kehoe brings up a supposed quote from General Douglas MacArthur that he thinks proved the general was in on some big secret about aliens. The problem? MacArthur never actually said what Kehoe claims he did. The famous line about the next war being interplanetary has been debunked. MacArthur never made that statement, especially not at West Point, where it's often said to have originated. Instead, the mayor of Naples once claimed MacArthur had said something along those lines, but even then, it was framed as a far-off, hypothetical scenario. Quote, 1,000 years from now, unquote, when modern civilization would seem as outdated as the Stone Age. MacArthur did later talk about the ideal of a final conflict between a united human race and the sinister forces of some other planetary galaxy. But this was years after Kehoe's interview. And even then, it wasn't some secret military admission. It was part of his speech about the astonishing advancements in science, energy, and medicine, calling them, quote, such dreams and fantasies as to make life the most exciting of all times, unquote. This interview alone is a perfect example of how Kehoe and plenty of UFO conspiracists since have twisted quotes, cherry-picked details, and misrepresented sources to make their claims sound more convincing than they really are. Like so many hoaxers and conspiracy pushers, Kehoe had a knack for making dramatic but ultimately meaningless challenges, like daring the Navy to reinstate him and court-martial him if he was lying. It was a move meant to make him seem sincere, but in reality, it's just plain ridiculous. The military couldn't reactivate him. Only Marines who had been retired for less than 30 years, technically still reservists, were eligible, and Kehoe had been out for 35 years. On top of that, for a long time, retirees weren't even subject to court-martial at all. That didn't change until 2020, when a retiree was court-martialed in a landmark case. But that was for serious crimes like attempted sexual assault, not for making misleading UFO claims. At the time Kehoe threw out this challenge, he was a civilian, completely outside military jurisdiction, and misleading the public about a supposed government cover-up wasn't a criminal offense. In fact, as a professional writer, he could say pretty much anything he wanted under the First Amendment, as long as he wasn't inciting violence. His whole challenge was just a publicity stunt. And really, that sums up Kehoe's entire career. Once he realized that writing about UFOs brought him fame and fortune, he ran with it, becoming a minor celebrity in the process. He even popped up on the game show, To Tell the Truth, where celebrity panelists had to guess which contestant was the real Donald Kehoe. Some people see his biggest contribution to UFOlogy as founding the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, a civilian UFO research group that lobbied for congressional hearings in 1966. But honestly, his real legacy was tying UFOlogy to conspiracy culture. He was one of the first to push the ideal of a massive government cover-up. Like most conspiracy theorists, though, his time in the spotlight didn't last forever. His career faded, and when NICAP went bankrupt, he was pushed out. By the 1980s, he was mostly out of the UFO scene, only making the occasional appearances at a conference. He passed away at 91 after years of declining health. Not exactly the fate of someone silenced by the shadowy forces he spent his life warning about. By the time Donald Kehoe passed away, another big name in UFO conspiracy circles had stepped into the spotlight. This time from a well-known and influential family, John Olson Lear. Born in 1942, was the son of Bill and Moya Lear. If the name Lear sounds familiar, it's because John's dad was the man behind the Lear jet, a pioneer in business aviation. Bill Lear was a self-taught inventor and industrialist who also played a huge role in miniaturizing electronics and even developed the 8-track music cartridge.
Hey friends, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap that little bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Wanna go the extra mile? share this with someone who might need it, and if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the links in the description. You can become a member, grab some merch, or just say, "Hi." Every little bit helps keep this thing rolling. Thanks for being here. You rock!
John Lear grew up in the shadow of his father's achievements, but carved out his own path, at least in his own way. He attended a boarding school in Switzerland, where he claimed to be the youngest American ever to climb the Matterhorn. There's no actual evidence of that, but honestly, that's one of the tamer claims Lear would go on to make. While his dad was building planes, John was flying them. In 1966, the same year UFO sightings in Michigan were brushed off as marsh gas and Congress reviewed Project Blue Book, Lear made headlines by flying one of his father's jets around the world in record time. Compared to Donald Kehoe, John Lear might have seemed like a more legitimate whistleblower when he later started talking about UFO cover-ups. After all, he claimed he had actually worked for U.S. intelligence during the Vietnam War. But what did that really mean? Turns out Lear was a pilot for Air America, an airline secretly owned by the CIA. Between 1967 and 1983, Air America pilots flew cargo planes carrying all kinds of things: livestock, rice, medical supplies, refugees, and yes, sometimes special forces, spies, or even questionable shipments for local allies involved in the drug trade. But at the end of the day, Lear was just a pilot, not someone with access to top-secret UFO intel. Like Kehoe before him, and David Grush today, Lear didn't have first-hand knowledge of a UFO cover-up. Instead, he pieced together his grand theories from second-hand stories, conspiracy circles, and sketchy sources. In 1987, he made waves by releasing a press statement outlining his claims, which caught the attention of Las Vegas journalist George Knapp. Knapp gave him airtime on KLAS-TV, a CBS affiliate, and just like that, Lear became a major player in UFO conspiracy culture. He often said his interest in UFOs came from sightings reported by his own family, though in classic Lear fashion, that may have been an exaggeration. There's no solid evidence that his father, Bill Lear, ever saw a UFO beyond John's word, but that was just the beginning. Lear didn't stop at the idea that pilots sometimes see strange things in the sky. He took it much farther, claiming that the U.S. government had recovered crashed alien spacecraft, retrieved extraterrestrial bodies, and even had living aliens in custody. He also went beyond the typical UFO lore, insisting there were multiple alien races that had been visiting Earth for decades, and that the government had been working with them in secret. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's a lot like what David Grush testified about before Congress in the summer of 2023. Except Lear's version was even wilder. More crashed ships, more alien bodies, and direct government collaboration with extraterrestrials. While many see Lear as a key figure in UFO conspiracy culture, the reality is that much like Kehoe before him, his biggest impact wasn't revealing secrets. It was fueling the ideal that government is hiding something from us. Just like Kehoe before him, John Lear made a lot of big claims during his interview with George Knapp. Claims that went unchallenged at the time, but don't hold up well under closer inspection. For instance, he insisted that tons of evidence existed to back up his wild stories, but that the press just wasn't interested. The problem? UFO stories had already been a huge deal in the 1950s and made a big comeback in the 1960s. Kehoe himself was all over TV back then, and Congress even held hearings on this subject in 1966. And besides, Lear was literally telling his story on TV at that very moment. So clearly, the press was paying attention. If mainstream journalists weren't running with his claims, maybe it was because they didn't hold water. Lear also followed Kehoe's old playbook, taking documents and quotes out of context to make it seem like he had uncovered a massive government cover-up. When Knapp asked him for actual proof, he pulled out a physics textbook used by the Air Force. Sounds official, right? Well, not really. First off, the textbook didn't confirm aliens were real. It simply described how they're commonly imagined. And to make things worse, Lear even misquoted the text. He claimed it said, "This leads us to believe in the unpleasant possibility of alien visitors." But the real quote was, "This leaves us with the unpleasant possibility of alien visitors." It's a small tweak, but it completely changes the meaning. In reality, the book's conclusion was pretty reasonable. Quote, "The best thing to do is to keep an open and skeptical mind, and not take an extreme position on any side of the question." Unquote. Then there's his claim that every U.S. president is in on the UFO cover-up. As evidence, he pointed to Ronald Reagan, who had made a few speeches about humanity might unite in the face of an alien threat. The problem? This ideal had been floating around for ages. Shows like Star Trek had explored it for years. And even back in 1917, psychologist John Dewey said something similar in a speech. So, unless Reagan was secretly dropping hints about aliens, it seems more likely he was just borrowing an old sci-fi style thought experiment. Lear also mentioned President Jimmy Carter, who once reported seeing a UFO and even promised to reveal any government-held UFO secrets. To Lear, this was proof that even presidents were pressured into silence. But if anything, it suggests the opposite. If Carter really had access to top-secret alien files, wouldn't he have spilled the beans when he had the chance? Almost everything John Lear claimed to have discovered in his research was really just borrowed from other UFO conspiracy theorists, many of whose wild claims have already been thoroughly debunked. Take his fascination with cattle mutilations, for example. He was a big fan of Linda Moulton Howe's documentary, A Strange Harvest, which suggested aliens were behind the mysterious death of livestock. Back in the midst of the satanic panic, some people blamed cults for these bizarre cases. But before long, aliens got the credit. A slightly more reasonable, though still conspiratorial, theory is that the government was secretly studying livestock for signs of mad cow disease. But the most logical and science-backed explanation? Nature's doing what nature does. Predators, scavengers, and even insects leave marks that look precise, but are really just a result of dehydration, decomposition, and hungry little critters. In that sense, this myth is kind of like old-school vampire folklore. People saw something creepy happening to bodies after death and jumped to the supernatural conclusions instead of, considering basic biology. And then there's Lear's truly ridiculous take on how these cattle were supposedly dissected. He once claimed that some of the incisions showed evidence of a laser being used because, wait for it, the cuts were made between the cells. The problem? All cuts are made between cells. That's literally how cutting works. A paper cut? Between the cells. Slice of tomato? Between the cells. even if you use an obsidian scalpel, one of the sharpest blades known to man, you're still just pushing cells aside, not slicing them individually. In reality, if someone actually found tissue where the cells were cut cleanly at the microscopic level, that might suggest laser precision. But even then, it wouldn't prove aliens, just that someone with a fancy lab got involved. So yeah, when Lear made these grand claims, he wasn't exactly hitting us with groundbreaking science. More like a mix of half-baked ideals and a little too much X-Files enthusiasm. If John Lear's shaky grasp of science and love for questionable theories wasn't enough, he also went all in on some straight-up hoaxes. One of his favorites? The infamous Majestic 12 hoax. Here's the gist. It all started with some supposedly leaked documents claiming the U.S. government had formed a top-secret group to cover up UFOs dating all the way back to the alleged Roswell crash in 1947. Now let's pause for a moment. These leaks conveniently landed in the lap of a close friend of Bill Moore, aka the guy who almost single-handedly turned Roswell into the pulp culture UFO juggernaut it is today. Oh, and there's actual evidence that Moore forged these documents and then snuck them into the National Archives, hoping people would assume they were legit. Not exactly the work of a crack investigative team. And if Bill Moore's name sounds familiar, that's because he's also the guy who popularized the Philadelphia experiment hoax. Yeah, the one about a battleship turning invisible and teleporting through time. And just to put the cherry on top of this credibility cake, it later came out that Moore had been working on a fiction novel that just so happened to sound suspiciously like the Majestic 12 story. So, yeah, probably not a coincidence. Then in 1989, Moore stood up in front of a bunch of UFO enthusiasts at a MUFON conference in Vegas and casually admitted that he had been spreading government disinformation fed to him by intelligent operative Rick Doty. At this point, you'd think people would finally throw out his Roswell, Philadelphia experiment and MJ-12 claimed once and for all. But nope. Instead, the community just turned on Moore himself while continuing to run with the stories. Except for one, the bizarre Dulce Base conspiracy, which Moore admitted was a psyop designed to mess with a UFO researcher named Paul Benowitz, who, tragically, was driven into a mental breakdown because of it. But guess who loved the Dulce Base story? Yep, John Lear. He pushed the wild claim that an underground base in New Mexico was a joint CIA alien operation, complete with batch of human body parts and full-on battle between humans and aliens after some intergalactic peace treaty went south. Where did he even get this stuff? Who knows? But once Moore admitted the Dulce story was fake, Lear mostly dropped it. Mostly. Even as his claims started falling apart, Lear's influence kept growing, thanks to his regular appearances on the Coast to Coast AM radio show with Art Bell. And even years later, while he kinda let go of the Dulce Base, he kept doubling down on Moore's other debunked stories, especially the Majestic 12 papers. Because, hey, why let a little thing like evidence get in the way of a good conspiracy? If John Lear's wild claims about the Dulce Base tells us anything, it's that he had a habit of latching on to outrageous UFO conspiracy theories and then cranking them up to 11. He'd start with a premise like Majestic 12 supposedly recovering alien bodies. and then he'd take it to a whole new level. Suddenly, he's talking about alien autopsies and tossing around fancy-sounding terms like extraterrestrial biological entities, EBEs, which conveniently popped up in later UFO documents that, let's be real, were probably forged to keep the MJ-12 story alive. But here's the thing. Whenever Lear talked about this stuff, he never actually had any hard evidence. He'd just say he had seen documents, which is UFO conspiracy speak for, trust me, bro. Yet, despite the lack of proof, he kept building on his claims. He was actually one of the first to float the ideal that Groom Lake, aka Area 51, was the place where alien prisoners were being held and their ships studied. But just like Grush today, Lear admitted he hadn't personally seen any of it. That tiny detail didn't stop him from getting even more creative, though. He went on to claim that these EBEs didn't eat food like us, but somehow absorbed nutrients through their skin. Oh, and they didn't even walk. They moved by thought alone, which, if true, makes you wonder why they even needed spaceships in the first place. Wouldn't teleportation be more efficient? And that's not even the most baffling part. In one interview with George Knapp, Lear confidently stated that the U.S. had recovered 10 to 15 alien craft and 30 to 50 alien bodies. But in his very next interview with Knapp, he suddenly upped the number of visiting alien species to 70. Now, hold on a second. If we only recovered 50 bodies, how do we know about the other 20 species? Were the rest still alive? And if so, were they all crammed together in those spacecraft like some kind of intergalactic Starfleet crew? He also claimed these aliens came from 5 different civilizations, which must have been the ultimate melting pot of extraterrestrial societies. At some point, the math just stops making sense. But hey, when has that ever stopped a good UFO story? For all of his outlandish claims, John Lear managed to rack up more TV appearances than even Donald Kehoe, though unfortunately a lot of them were on some seriously questionable History Channel shows like Brad Meltzer's Decoded, America's Book of Secrets, and of course, Ancient Aliens. You know, the kind of stuff that makes real historians want to bang their heads against the desk. During his time in the spotlight, Lear made all sorts of bold predictions, none of which ever came true. Case in point, when discussing UFO abductions, he confidently declared, with zero actual evidence, that abductees were being programmed, like something out of The Boys from Brazil, to go somewhere and do something huge within the next 5 years. And yet, here we are, still waiting. By the end of his life, even believers started side-eyeing him. Even George Knapp, who's pretty open to wild claims, had to admit that Lear had gone completely off the deep end. One of his later gems? That more than 90 alien races were living on the sun. Yep, you heard that right. Apparently the sun is less of a giant ball of burning plasma and more of a bustling cosmic apartment complex. Early on, Lear seemed like a credible guy, exposing mind-blowing secrets. But by the time he was done, even die-hard UFO fans had to admit he was, well, a total crackpot. And yet, some folks today are trying to use David Grush's claims about the alien wreckage and the retrieved pilots to argue that Lear was actually right all along. But let's be real, Lear was just parroting those same kinds of stories back in the day, much like Grush is now. And let's not forget all the other absolutely bonkers claims that Lear made. Stuff so out there that it's safe to say it'll never be convincingly backed up. Sure, he always said time would prove him right, but at this point, time has proven him wrong so many times that there's just no coming back from it. When you step back and look at 100 years of UFO claims, a pattern starts to emerge. One that should make us pause before jumping on the Grush bandwagon. The same old government cover-up story has been circulating since Donald Kehoe's day. And as we've seen, his so-called evidence was about as sturdy as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Now, the same basic claims are making the rounds again, just with a fresh coat of paint. This time framed as a government agency's failing to be completely transparent with Congress. Shocking, right? Who would have guessed the government might be less than forthcoming about what it's doing? To be fair, the 2017 New York Times article about Pentagon black-budget UAP programs did confirm that money was being funneled into UFO research. But let's be real, that's not exactly breaking news. What was different about this most recent congressional hearing, the first of its kind since 1966, mind you, wasn't that it exposed hidden funding, but that it gave UFO enthusiasts a golden opportunity to roll out the same old alien retrieval conspiracy theories for a brand new audience. And speaking of those crash retrieval stories, those have been floating around since Roswell, pushed forward by the MJ-12 hoax, which we can thank Bill Moore for. You know, the guy exposed as a literal disinformation agent. Then, of course, John Lear came along and ran with it, tossing in even wilder details for good measure. Turns out, Lear wasn't exactly the world's most reliable source either. And just like Kehoe and Lear before him, Grush isn't actually claiming to have seen anything himself. He's just repeating what he says others have told him. Now, to his credit, Grush at least went through the proper legal channels to get official whistleblower status. And sure, testifying under oath in a congressional hearing makes him seem more credible than someone doing the rounds on the late-night radio. Plus, the fact that his statements were cleared by his employer might make it seem like everything he says must be true. But let's not forget, being cleared just means he's not spilling classified info. Not that any of it actually happened. In fact, if his claims were real, wouldn't they be too classified to talk about in a public hearing? And let's be honest, this wouldn't be the first time someone swore under oath to something that turned out to be totally bogus. Even if everything Grush says is false, it wouldn't technically be perjury unless someone could prove that nobody ever told him these things in the first place. That's a tough task, considering he won't even say who told him. So, with all that in mind, why is this being taken so seriously? How did an unverified UFO story suddenly become a headline-grabbing congressional event? If we were to pull out our conspiracy board and connect the red string from Grush's photo, we find a direct line leading back to, yep, you guessed it, John Lear. Through various media figures, Lear introduced these stories to the public, including the man who first put him on TV, George Knapp. Knapp has spent decades platforming UFO whistleblowers, and surprise, surprise, he now has some connection to David Grush. But we'll get into that little twist in part 2.